The previous discussion summarizes as follows. Democracies are preferable to autocracies in their fiscal policies because they're able to prevent the capture of government by ruling class or perhaps some other vested interests. And as a result, no public revenues are misappropriated to benefit political elites, and the incentives to supply public goods and production inputs are stronger than it would have been in the case of imperfect democracies and autocracies. However, it would be perhaps simplistic and naive to view democracies as fiscal paradises. This view is excessively sanguine. It is well known that democracies have very serious fiscal problems of their own, and these are the problems that I would like to discuss with you now. The root causes of these problems is diversity. Different individuals, different voters, different households might have different preferences over government's fiscal policies. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, these fiscal policies are the same for every individual, and as a result, this is a source of political conflicts. It would be ideal if everyone had similar views as to what fiscal policies governments have to implement. If everyone was in agreement over what mix of tax rates and public expenditures would be preferable. In this case, the only thing that the government would have to do is to implement this will of the society, and it would be indeed a social consensus. In reality, such consensus is almost never observed because, as I said, preferences are quite diverse. And this diversity of preferences causes at least two types of economic problems when it comes to public economic decisions. The first one is that public economic decisions do not have any longer to be socially optimal, because when preferences are not identical, democratic governments do not implement the will of the society at large. They implement the will of some social majority, and this majority's preferences do not have to be identical to the considerations of wealth of the society and overall economic efficiency. I mentioned already as an example an economically polarized society when you have a relatively poor majority and a small wealthy class. And in that case, democratically endorsed fiscal policies will probably call for excessively high and economically inefficient taxes. The second reason, perhaps even worse, is that under democracy, attempts to find an aggregation of diverse preferences and to implement an appropriately defined majority will could lead to policy gridlocks. And the best way to illustrate this gridlock is the so-called paradox of Condorcet, or Condorcet cycles. It's very simple to illustrate the problem that occurs in such cases. Suppose that there is a society which is comprised of three individuals, 1, 2, and 3, and these individuals have to make a choice over a set of policies, and there are only 3 policies to choose from, and it doesn't really matter at this point what exactly these policies are, X, Y, and Z. Now let's describe the preferences of each of the individuals. In the case of the first individual, let's denote her preferences by P1. She thinks that X is best, Y is second best, and Z is the worst. So X is preferred over Y, and Y is preferred over Z. Now, in the case of second individual, he thinks that in fact Y is the best, Z would be the second best, and X is the worst. So Y, Z, and X. And in the case of the third individual, she thinks that Z in fact is the best choice. The second best, the next one would be X, and the third one would be Y. And you probably have observed that X, Y, and Z are replacing each other in this so-called preference profiles cyclically. Okay, given these preferences, let's try to aggregate them democratically, and let's try to rank all the alternatives from the point of view of the majority. Well, in our case, majority is just 2 individuals. So if you want to aggregate these preferences in a democratic fashion, we should conclude that, for example, X is better than Y if there are at least two individuals who agree that X is better than Y. In that case, we'll have a majority behind the social preference of X over Y. So let's see how many people believe that X is better than Y. The first one certainly thinks that X is better than Y, and the third one agrees. See, X is still better than Y. So we have a majority which is comprised of the first individual, the third one, which support the social preference that X is better than Y. Now let's compare Y and Z. And what we see here is that the first and the second individuals are unanimous in preferring Y over Z. So again, we have a majority. This time it's comprised of the first and the second individual stating that Y is better than Z. So far so good. So perhaps X would be the best choice, Y would be the second best, and Z would be the third best, and the society would be happy and safe to implement X. Well, not quite, because let's compare finally Z and X. And what we find out is that the second individual and the third one believe that Z is better than X. And therefore we also have a majority saying that Z is better than X. And therefore the social ranking, which implements the majority rule, X is better than Y is better than Z, and Z is better than X, leads to a cycle. And it's useless. You cannot really use this ranking in public decision making, and you cannot tell much as to which of these alternatives is preferred by a majority. So this is an example of policy gridlocks which occur when you try to implement a majority will or a majority rule in a society with vastly diverse preferences. Well, this is a frustrating example because it shows how the democracy as an aggregation of preferences rule has its limits. But perhaps this is simply because we interpret democracy in the wrong way. Perhaps there is another interpretation of democracy, another way, another means to aggregate individual preferences which would not cause such problems and which would provide us with some more practical and useful tools of public policy decision-making, including fiscal policy decision-making. So how such aggregation rule could look like? This question was asked in mid-20th century by the famous American economist, Nobel Prize winner Arrow, and the answer was provided in the famous Arrow's impossibility theorem, which says that our attempts to find an aggregation rule that reflects some democratic principles and other reasonable requirements and does not produce cycles of the kind that we just observed, this search would be fruitless. No such rule exists. And this is precisely what Arrow's impossibility theorem is all about. Here is a precise formulation of this theorem. Suppose that there are at least 3 alternatives to choose from, and there are several individuals, n individuals for that matter, and each of these individuals has her own preferences over this set of alternatives, and we want to find a way to aggregate these preferences and to make sure that this aggregation meets several quite natural requirements. The first requirement is called unrestricted domain. And that means that your aggregation rule can handle every set of preferences, even if they are quite different from each other. Again, it would be a fairly simple thing to aggregate identical preferences or preferences which are close to each other. The challenge is to aggregate preferences which might be diverse, as they were in these examples. So our first condition is that this rule has an unrestricted domain. We cannot refuse to aggregate some preferences simply because it's too complex a task. We should have a rule. We are looking for a rule that works under any circumstances. The second requirement is also quite natural. It's called, perhaps not very precisely, Pareto efficiency, but what it means is that if every individual believes that some alternative X is better than the other alternative Y, then the society has to agree. And therefore it has to endorse individual preferences over 2 alternatives if there is no disagreement among individuals over choosing from these 2 alternatives. The third requirement is kind of more technical, but it also makes a lot of sense, and that basically means that the society's choice between 2 alternatives, X and Y, should depend entirely on how every member of the society compares these two alternatives, and it should not involve the association of the comparisons of these alternatives to some other irrelevant alternatives, to some other alternative z. In other words, to decide whether x is better than y, all I need to know is what every person thinks about the comparison between x and y, and I should not be involving in such deliberation irrelevant alternatives. The fourth requirement is the requirement of rationality in all cycles, and this is precisely the requirement that we want to have an aggregation rule which does not produce such unfortunate combinations and outcomes. Well, let's stop here for a second and ask ourselves if there is an aggregation rule that meets the first four of these requirements. And the answer is yes, there is one, and in fact there are quite a few of them. These are dictatorial rules. In other words, ignore preferences of every agent, say but the first one or the second, whatever. Pick an agent, call this agent a dictator, that's a metaphor. She doesn't have to be a dictator, but just follow this agent's preferences. And this aggregation rule, which technically involves all other preferences, but in reality ignores them, would quite obviously meet all four of these requirements. And again, a simple exercise for you would be to check that this is indeed the case. But quite obviously, that would not be a democratic aggregation procedure. And therefore, we add the additional fifth requirement, and this is the requirement of non-dictatorship, and ask if there is an aggregation rule which meets all five of these requirements. And the answer, as it is given by Arrow's impossibility theorem, is quite clear and quite disappointing. No, there is no such a rule. In other words, there is no way to universally implement democratic aggregation of individual preferences.